It's been a while since we've done a rapid-fire physiology and fitness episode, but today's the day. Whether you're a serious athlete or someone looking to make the most of their personal and professional outcomes, you're going to love this one. Today's guest, Brady Holmer, is a must-follow for those dialed into the latest insights on human physiology. You know I love this stuff, and I read everything I can get my hands on, and I continue to learn from Brady. And kind of enjoy his sense of humor along the way if you follow him on Twitter or what we now call X. Brady's a researcher for Examine.com, writes an excellent weekly physiology update for SubStack, and has a master's degree in human performance from the University of Florida. He lives in Austin, Texas, with his wife, son, and their dog Bannister. And those who love physiology will give an understanding nod to the dog's perfect name. Thanks for making the Coaching Lab podcast a regular part of your week. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching, and I'm excited about this interview, probably as much as any we've had in a while. Hold on to your hat. We are going to cover a lot of info. If you're an employer or EAP, you've probably grown tired of the coaching element that doesn't have much engagement and certainly doesn't provide much in terms of results. Catalyst Coaching takes a different approach that might just be the solution you've been seeking. Rather than a generic call center, Catalyst board-certified coaches take a personalized, relationship-centric approach to helping each individual employee discover and move toward the best version of themselves. Change is tough. We get that. Why not take advantage of the value-based, outcome-oriented approach of Catalyst that helps make it a reality? All the details at catalystcoaching360.com, or please reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoaching360.com. And now, it's time to up our game with Brady Holmer on the latest episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. Welcome to the show, Brady. We met in quotes, through Twitter. I love your stuff, but then you do it in a humorous way. So I thought you'd be a great guest. Thanks for jumping on. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, Brad, thanks a lot. It's been great to follow you on Twitter/X, whatever we're calling it.
Exactly.
Interactions are always good. I learn a lot from you, so it's going to be awesome, I think, to speak with you today. And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, let's kick off with VO2 max. It's getting so much energy and attention lately, not just for you and I trying to improve our athletic performance, but life, longevity, quality of life, all those things. What do we know about it? What are we learning? What's the new stuff?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I mean, VO2 max isn't really something new, right? I mean, runners, cyclists, endurance athletes have known about it for over a century now. Actually, I think a few years ago was actually the birthday of VO2 max, the 100th birthday of VO2 max, right? which is kind of neat since the discovery of it. So, for a century we've known this is an important component of endurance performance for athletes. Endurance athletes are going to have a high VO2 max generally. It's not the only indicator of performance. Once you get to the very high levels, a high VO2 max is a prerequisite. You got to have a 60, 70, 80 VO2 max to even enter the club.
It's your ticket in the door.
Athlete.
Exactly.
But among athletes with the highest VO2 max, it's not always the guy or the gal with the highest VO2 max that wins, which is kind of a good thing. It adds that element of surprise and serendipity to sports. If it were just all like a math equation, it would be kind of boring, right? I mean, he's got an 80 and I got a 70. He's going to beat me. So other things like efficiency at velocity at VO2 max, your lactate threshold, things like that, those also go into determining performance. So we recognize VO2 max is important for performance, but it's not the be all and end all, which I think is an important thing to note for endurance athletes. But like you also mentioned, now it's become repopularized, I guess, in terms of its associations with health and longevity. So I wouldn't say that this is generally new either, but it's newer within, the last 10 to 20 years. There have been multiple studies now which have shown a higher VO2 max is associated with lower risks for cardiometabolic conditions, greater life expectancy, or put another way, lower all-cause mortality. pretty strong association, pretty consistent among these studies. And so now it's kind of become this buzzword in health and fitness. You want to improve your VO2 max so you can live longer, which I think is great because people are becoming aware of VO2 max, and whether VO2 max actually matters or not. The fact that people are aware of it is pointing to this idea that cardiorespiratory fitness is on people's radars now. They're interested in running or cycling or doing whatever it takes to improve their VO2 max in hopes that it will lower their risk for diseases and make them live longer. I've written several articles on it. Every time something comes out where it's like, oh, VO2 max is associated with longevity, I like to write about it because I have this very keen interest in it now. And one of the reasons I think why I'm so interested in it and kind of trying to stay on top of the emerging data is because there's sort of this debate now. And I actually kind of had this back and forth with Dr. Steve Magnus on X the other day. And I go back.
He's been a guest twice on our show. Yeah, I love the guy. Love the guy.
Steve is great and kind of similar to me, tries to like sometimes present a sense of humor in his science stuff on social media. So he's a bit more skeptical in terms of if you increase your VO2 max, does that even mean you'll live longer? So like, is there a causal role of improving cardiorespiratory fitness on actually making you live longer? Because most of these studies now are just associations. And the reason for that is because it's going to be hard to say, let's follow these people for 40 or 50 years and see if they increase their VO2 max or, if they change their VO2 max, is that then associated with them living longer, or if their VO2 max goes down with them like living shorter, or, exercise training. If we train people to increase their VO2 max, does that add years to their life? Does that reduce their disease risk? I don't think we can say that for certain with regards to VO2 max. All we can say is that higher VO2 max is associated with mortality. So what Steve and I kind of had this back and forth, and this wasn't the first time, but is there a causal role of VO2 max rather than just this like mere association? I'm a little bit more convinced that I think that there is a causal role, because you of all people and everyone else knows exercise makes us healthier. So like, if we improve our VO2 max, of course, there's an argument to be made. Maybe it's not the VO2 max per se that is causing us to live longer. It's the underlying changes that increase VO2 max that are then associated with you being healthier. So your heart actually gets healthier. Your risk factors go down. Your mitochondria function better. All those things drive VO2 max to increase. But those also then are associated with better long-term health. But I think we're arguing sort of over just semantics here in this case. Like, well, yeah, there's no like literal VO2 max particle flowing in our blood that is like a risk factor. But it's all of these underlying changes, and the fact that VO2 max reflects this coordinated ability of our body to, synchronize our mitochondria in our lungs and our cardiovascular system and our endothelial function to produce this metric of performance. That in and of itself, I think, is important in determining, health span and lifespan. So I am somewhat convinced, and of course we need more data, but that, if you increase your VO2 max, you are benefiting your health span and lifespan. And of course, yes, exercise in general is good, even if you don't improve your VO2 max. But I think there's something there, but there's a bit more to the story for sure.
Well, and we obviously have some folks listening who are going, wait, VO2 what? So I've typically suggested to folks, your easiest way to test this, if you're able, is do a 5K, walk, run, jog, whatever. And that gives you a wonderful baseline. There's a lot of charts online that you can just plug in your 5K time. It'll spit out an approximate VO2 max. Other suggestions, or is that kind of your go-to recommendation as well for those who are able?
Yeah, my number one recommendation, and of course, this is somewhat limited by accessibility, but is to just go to a laboratory and get a test. The fact that it's become a bit more popular now, I think has been a good thing, because there are a lot of places that will do these tests for $100 to $150. You could go on a weekend. So if you're located somewhere that has a university with a sports science department, a kinesiology department, they will often offer this as a as a service. There are physical therapy clinics I know that offer it as a service. Your doctor probably isn't going to do it unless you're doing a stress test, but there are multiple places where it's just direct to consumer metabolic testing. So you can go and get it for probably around $150, which just given like all the great data on VO2 max now is probably a worthwhile investment. I mean, $150 is, pennies on the dollar for the information that you're going to get from that test. So let's say you
pause just for a second on there. Yeah. So sports specificity importance, you're gearing up for a marathon right now. If you went and did a VO2 max running compared to, and I know you like Zwift as well, but let's say you never did get on the bike and then you went and did a VO2 max test using a bike instead, ergometer, instead of running, would your results be different, or is it just within a couple of percentage points?
It would probably be different for someone like me who trains both. Right. I'm predominantly a runner, so I'm going to score higher on a running test of VO2 max than I would probably with cycling, but it wouldn't be that far off. If you're someone who has never sat on a bike and actually done some kind of dedicated bicycle training, not just saying, I could ride a bike, but I could probably work out and get myself to a heavy exertion on a bike. I would not recommend doing it on a bike. I would do a walking or a running test.
Pick your area of expertise. Yeah. Okay.
To your activity. Correct. And maybe, if you do a lot of rowing exercise and there's a place that offers a rower, then maybe choose that as well. It's very less common.
Right.
Cycling and running are most people are going to have you do it on a treadmill, which everyone's familiar with walking and or running. And so for most people, you're going to end up just walking during the entire test. It's just going to be a very steep walk. So you're going to get to your max, but you're going to be walking, 3-4 miles per hour up a very, very steep hill, like 12 to 20% grade or something like that. But that's a great point you bring up, Brad, about the specificity. Choose the modality that you're kind of most comfortable with, on which you feel you could push yourself kind of to your max.
And don't watch American Flyers before you go in for your test.
No, exactly.
Flying off the back. Okay, so I interrupted you. Chain of thought there. Otherwise, I can come back to a follow-up on that one.
Yeah. One more thing. So if you're not going to or willing to or able to do a laboratory test, my next suggestion would be to do a 12-minute run.
Okay, more
test.
The Cooper test.
Called the Cooper test. Just due to
nothing to do with me, folks. Sorry.
Well, yeah, not the Brad Cooper test, the Kenneth Cooper test. Yes. So this one was developed a while ago, and it's used by the military. So there's just a lot of data behind it, like lots of data points. And so I think it's one of the more reliable calculators to use to estimate. Again, this is an estimation, but to estimate your VO2 max. So just go out, run, or walk very fast as far as you can in 12 minutes. And then you can just type in Cooper 12-minute test calculator online, plug your distance in that you covered in 12 minutes. It'll spit out your VO2 max. It might ask you to provide some additional information on are you male, female, your height, weight, things like that. But that one is a pretty good and well-tested, reliable way to estimate VO2 max.
And folks, if you do that, you want to do it on a track or with a GPS. Don't depend on your treadmill. There's too many variables with incline and the pace of the belt and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so for I'll kind of say elite athlete, but kind of the serious amateur, let's say serious amateur, how do they increase their VO2 max beyond what they're already doing in their daily training? Any additional tweaks they can add in that might have an impact beyond get in your long run, get in your tempo work, get in your speed work? Are there other things that can tweak that?
Yeah, I like the fact that you brought that up because, I've just talked to multiple people, whether it's on a podcast or just like direct messaging back and forth. It's like, what's the best protocol or what's the best type of training to increase VO2 max? And that discussion could go on forever. I don't really think that there's a right answer because, Brad, everybody's like, what's the optimal interval duration for improving VO2 max? Well, we don't know. And it really just depends on a lot of things like, probably like 2 to 5 minutes. But I mean, whether 2 minutes is better than 5 and whether the 2-to-1 work to rest ratios are better, there's like so many discussions that can happen on that. And so I think what's a little more interesting, at least to me, is like you said, to talk about maybe some additional things that we can use to like move the needle a bit more, because the science of training is kind of down pat. I don't really have a lot new to provide there. People have been honing training for for centuries on how to increase VO2 max. But like you said, for people at that level as well, some of the main performance benefits are probably going to come maybe not even from improving their VO2 max, but from improving their efficiency and things like that. But to get back to your question, so you're looking to increase your VO2 max and maybe use some strategies to get there that aren't necessarily just directly like running or cycle training. I think, using, say, heat exposure, so sauna or hot baths, those seem to have a decent amount of evidence in terms of their ability to increase hemoglobin mass or your plasma volume. And so if you're able to increase either of those variables, and for those maybe who may be listening and wondering like, what the hell does that mean? Hemoglobin mass is essentially, the percent of your blood that is red blood cells. And so if you're able to kind of increase that, you're going to increase your VO2 max. You're going to have a higher oxygen carrying capacity in your blood. So that could be one strategy, combining, say, a training run with post-exercise sauna, getting in a hot bath after your training session. It might not result in the largest changes in VO2 max possible. But again, for people looking for anything that's going to help, looking for that extra edge, that could possibly be something to look into. And I don't know if you've used any like heat exposure strategies yourself, but it seems to have benefits just outside of, or I guess in addition to just, improving your heat tolerance, which can be beneficial in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We're going to have David Roche on in a couple of weeks, who just broke the Leadville record. And he talks extensively about that in terms of combining those two and the small window that if I do that today, my benefit probably disappears a week to 10 days from now, maybe even 5 days from now. So it needs to be a regular part of our routine. It can't be oh yeah, I did that last Monday. Okay. It's got to be, you've got to keep that up. Let's talk about magic a little bit here. Recovery solutions. Every social media person has something they're selling. Everybody has, you name it, the routine. What does the evidence tell us about what does and doesn't work at this point in the game?
Yeah. So as far as, when most people think about recovery, they're kind of thinking about all of the cool little gadgets that you can do. I'm going to wear my compression socks, right, or I'm going to get into my $1,500, I don't know what the boots are called.
Yeah,
I can't remember what the compression
Everybody's
boots
picturing
are called.
them. Yeah.
My $1,500 compression boots, or I'm going to, wear my fancy recovery shoes. So there's, those things haven't been subjected to like rigorous study. There's very little to kind of support the fact that they work. Do they make you feel better? Certainly. Do I use them? Certainly. But even without, the rigorous so-called evidence that might be there to support them. The biggest thing I think that can help promote / expedite recovery are nutritional strategies. And so even then, not a lot to support some of these. I think something like tart cherry juice to take after exercise to maybe reduce some of the inflammation could potentially be there. There actually is some good evidence from like randomized controlled trials there to support tart cherry juice. One of the things that actually is on my radar now, and I think is probably, going to be even more well supported as it's subjected to kind of more rigorous study, but is, you've probably heard, Brad, of like the post-exercise anabolic window as it refers to protein intake. Mm-hmm. So the thinking that it's kind of been dismissed in regards to muscle building and protein intake, but I got to eat within 30 minutes of my workout, or this, anabolic window is closed and I'm sacrificing my gains if I don't eat 20 to 30 grams of protein after my weightlifting session. That's sort of been dismissed in terms of as long as you eat a meal within 3 hours and as long as you get sufficient protein intake in the rest of the day, you're probably okay. But I think that there's an anabolic window, so-called anabolic window for carbohydrate for endurance athletes that if you kind of miss it, it's going to impair your next day recovery. So I think that consuming carbohydrates and protein, of course, so like, just eating a meal, but carbohydrate, protein, maybe you're eating a protein shake, as close to the end of your workout as possible is going to be one of the best things that you can do for recovery. There's actually this new study that has just come out. I have yet to read the full thing, but essentially showing that delaying post-exercise carbs, it reduces your performance during the next day's training session.
Interesting.
Even though it didn't appear to reduce glycogen restoration or anything like that. So there's some like mechanism that's going on that we might not know. The thinking would be that, your glycogen isn't fully replenished and that's kind of diminishing your performance, but it didn't seem to be because of that. So I think that there's a lot probably going on there with like the nervous system, the central nervous system and sensing of fuel. And again, I have yet to read that full paper, but all of this is just to say that runners, and myself included, are typically of the mindset, well, I'm not working out twice today. I did my morning workout. I just need to be sure to hydrate and refuel the rest of the day and I'll be fine. The timing isn't necessarily important. I've kind of changed my mind on that. And I think that the timing is important. So you think about recovery starting during the workout and immediately after. And I think that the next day's performance will be much better. So really fueling up as soon as you can after a workout seems to be a good option for improving recovery.
That's outstanding. I have not read that yet. That's excellent information. Yeah, we had Stuart Phillips on talking about protein. He's done a lot around that window not really being there. And Christy Answaden, who wrote Good to Great a few years ago, she joined us and was talking about some of the baloney stuff that you mentioned early on. But yeah, that's really interesting because we seem to be focused so much on protein, creatine, some of those, maybe some greens, but that the carbohydrate within that brief window or even within the workout, getting more and more attention. So that's good.
Certainly within the workout. And I mentioned that the recovery sort of starts during the workout. And I think that, we often think about, when you're done, you need to start refueling, but you can pre-fuel for workouts as well and consume carbohydrates or, sources of nutrition during your workout as well. And so you're kind of just like limiting that hole that you're digging yourself in during the workout. And that's going to, if you start with a less deep hole, then you don't really have to dig yourself out of that hole with as much nutrition and carbohydrates. So the same goes for hydration, I think, as well. So, if I'm sure you've experienced this during this summer. But if you get really, really, really dehydrated on a run, like performance kind of the next day sucks, even if that you've hydrated well for the rest of the day. There just seems to be something off about like the next day that's impaired because of that severe dehydration that you kind of built yourself into during the workout. So just things for athletes to think about, what are you eating before? How are you hydrating before, during, and then especially after, again, that might sound like something completely new, but I think this idea of impairing next day's recovery based on your nutrition is kind of this novel idea that is gaining more attention.
This is awesome. All right. So let's talk practical elements. Well, first of all, the past, I would say decade, the fat metabolism element has been so much in the center of the radar for endurance athletes that, at least for myself and many folks that I've read and interviewed, it's been the opposite. Let's go in, let's just get our workout in, we'll eat afterward, but no reason to, unless you're doing a 3-hour session, there's no reason to have drinks or gels or bars or eat beforehand. Just go do your thing, come back, and then you can get it. But you're saying, okay, yeah, that's what we've been saying, but it's not what we're going to be saying.
I think so, because I do think we're kind of getting into this almost carb-centric approach to endurance fueling now. Not that hasn't always been the case. I mean, athletes have known again for centuries, carbohydrates, that's kind of primarily what we want to fuel with. And then you're kind of right that there seems to be still this prevailing notion that, well, we want to increase our ability to utilize fat as well. And the thinking behind that kind of goes, and the theory makes sense, and then I'll kind of get into maybe why it doesn't necessarily seem to play out. So the thinking is that if you improve your ability to oxidize fat during exercise, you'll rely less on carbohydrates at exercise, particularly, maybe if you train yourself up to being able to use, you reach your fat max at like 80 to 85% of your VO2 max, which is pretty high, typically higher than when most people would hit their maximal fat oxidation, somewhere between 60 and 70% of like their maximal. So you're oxidizing more fat, you're using less carbs, and therefore you're sparing your muscle glycogen. So you need to fuel with less carbohydrates during exercise. And I think that...
And less gut issues as a result.
Less gut issues because you don't have to fuel as much. Exactly. And I think that theory is somewhat sound. I mean, guys like Zach Bitter are sort of proving that you can do low-ish carb. He's not, zero carb or super low carb, but he's lower carb than your traditional endurance athlete. And he's showing that you can excel at those distances, 50 miles, 100 miles plus on a lower carbohydrate diet. But then, there are also ultra guys who are doing high carb. David Roche, prime example, who are also successful. So many roads, to Rome in that case. But I just think that, when subjected to kind of, actually, let's look at this study where, if these athletes are exercising fasted, or if they have carbohydrates, or if they fuel with fat, it doesn't necessarily ever seem to make that big of a difference in terms of their performance. And I think that is a result of, there seems to be something going on, and this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but I think that we often think too kind of compartmentally about, oh, well, what's the reason we eat carbs during exercise? Just to delay our, glycogen depletion. We want to make sure we have enough glucose, enough glycogen available to fuel exercise. If you go beyond 90 minutes, then you should fuel, because we don't really, our glycogen stores start to run low. There's actually some decent evidence that taking in carbohydrates during exercise doesn't necessarily even prevent glycogen depletion, actually. There have actually been some really well done studies that show that, which is kind of interesting, contradictory to what many people would think. And there are studies also showing that if you consume carbohydrates and exercise under kind of 90 minutes, you can improve your performance. So like, what's going on there? If it's not due to glycogen, why do we perform better? If I eat something before a 5K or a 10K and I run faster as a result, what's going on there? Because even anything up to a half marathon in someone who is even a pretty talented runner, so who's doing that in 60 minutes to 90 minutes or whatever, you're not going to run out of glycogen.
Right.
So I could run a fast half marathon.
Yeah, exactly.
I could run a fast half marathon with no fuel. You don't need to. And I think Sage Candidate posted something about this a few months ago, and I replied to it. I don't remember what I said, but he's like, I don't use gels during the half. The risk of digestive upset is not worth the fact that I know I'm not going to run out of glycogen and I can run a fine race. Well, that's true. You're not going to run out of glycogen, but I think that, again, glycogen is just one part of the story. And the fact that we don't technically run out of it, which we never actually do because we would die, our body really only allows us to get to about a 40% kind of reduction in glycogen before it's like, okay, we're going to put on the brakes here because we're sensing like an energy crisis type of thing. So we don't ever run out of it. Our body is not a car with a fuel gauge, where we have to increase the amount of gas that we're putting in it. And if we run low, then we just die. Our body also has these sensors, where it can sense how much glycogen kind of is in the muscles in a probably a vague way. But the central nervous system is very sensitive to changes in that stuff. And so I think that there's much more going on in terms of the central nervous system with regards to carbohydrates and how it influences performance. So taking in a gel in a shorter race or eating something beforehand is sort of giving your brain this indicator that, oh, we have enough fuel on board. We're allowed to push a little bit harder. And the perfect example of this is the fact that if you just swish carbohydrates around in your mouth and spit it out, it improves performance. You don't even have to
You're just signaling.
ingest it. I just take a swig of Gatorade, there's some sugar in there, swish it out, spit it on the side of the road. They've shown that improves performance, endurance performance. And so clearly it's not a fuel issue. It's clearly an issue of the body is sensing that these are available. And so for that reason, I think that there's this, we should advocate kind of carbohydrates during performance just due to that fact, not from the glycogen, standpoint. Obviously, they do provide fuel when you eat them. Sure. I don't think that you should spit them because, it's good to take them in because it actually is providing you with fuel. But so that idea just goes to show, I think that there's a lot more involved here in how the body is sensing the fuel sources. And I think for that reason, I'm a bit more bullish on the carbohydrates thing, less so on we need to become better metabolizers of fat, because endurance athletes already are. They already are very good at using fat as a fuel, even if they don't ever do fasted exercise. Their mitochondria are robust. If we increase our mitochondrial capacity, independent of whether we're doing a lot of fasting or fasted exercise training or whatever, and that's going to allow us to be better metabolizers of fat. So Tour de France riders, I don't know how concerned they are with, getting better at burning fat. I think it's they're interested in other ways to improve performance.
Yeah, when we were doing Race Across America, it was just whatever we could get in our bodies. If you can get it down, we don't care what it is, just eat it. So let's talk about the practical side of that. What steps do you take? You're training for, I think, a marathon right now. What are you doing with your training? Are you grabbing a gel, a banana, eating a shake beforehand, have some water hidden away halfway through your run, or water with some kind of, Gatorade-ish type thing? What is your strategy, or what would you recommend to folks that are out there saying, ooh, well, that's kind of interesting?
Yeah, it's honestly something I've gotten a lot better at. And I actually was literally on Sunday, I did a podcast with someone and we were talking about, we both were collegiate athletes and we were just talking about training in college. And I don't think that I had a sip of water or a taste of an energy gel during any run throughout my entire collegiate career. I mean, I would do 18, 20, 22-mile long runs, and I wouldn't touch a carbohydrate during the entire run. I wouldn't think twice about it. And of course, the training was fine. I didn't, die during any of those runs, and it was fine. But I felt like I left probably a lot on the table there in terms of, like we just talked about, my recovery, but then also just feeling better during the run. Just because you can do something fasted doesn't mean you should do it. There's a big difference between can and should. So do I think people should fuel for every single run? Probably not. If you have a 60 to 90-minute run, relatively lower intensity, especially if it's in the morning, you're just waking up, you can just go out and do that. Drink some water beforehand, have your coffee, and just go on a run. Typically, I run 4 days a week right now. 2 of my runs during the week are just easier 60 to 90-minute runs. I don't eat anything beforehand. I rarely bring water unless it's very, very, very hot. And I think I'm going to need it sometimes. So, but when I'm being more specific, when I'm trying to be more intentional about it, so if I have a long workout planned that day, or a long run, so it's going to be something like 2 hours or longer, I'm definitely doing a fueling strategy. And for a long run, what that looks like is I don't need anything beforehand. If I'm going into a race, I probably will. So I'll have something like one of those energy waffles, something easy on the stomach, just like for breakfast, maybe a banana. For my training runs, though, I just feel better running like most people do with as little kind of actual food in my stomach as possible.
Totally.
You just feel lighter and you don't want to risk that distress. So I don't eat anything beforehand, but I'm sure to hydrate a lot. Water, electrolytes before I head out. And then right now, what my strategy is I do a gel every half hour. So if I'm going for 2 hours, that's 3 gels. If I'm going over 2 hours, that's typically 4 gels. I'll take another one at the 4-hour mark or 2-hour mark. Sorry. And each of those is 25, 30 grams of carbohydrates, about 100 calories. So I certainly could up that number, and I probably will when I race, and maybe in some more kind of marathon specific, like long runs, but 30, 25 to 30 grams of carbs every 30 minutes, that equals about 50, 60 grams per hour, which is on the lower end of kind of what's recommended, but it's not super low. Some of the athletes now are trying to push 90 to 100 grams per hour. And that's a lot. And I think we see this it is a huge amount. We see it in cycling more, which makes sense. It's easier to eat on the bike. Right. Your gut's not a problem. You're not sloshing it around. You're not jostling it.
You got a big pocket.
Exactly. You can store all that stuff. So 50 to 60 per hour, it keeps me feeling good. And I think that is a good fueling strategy. And that's what I do now. I also do that on my workout days too. So during my warm up, which is typically 30 minutes, I'll take a gel at the end of that warm up. And then I'll take another gel about halfway through my interval session, which typically, again, is that might be 30 to 50 minutes of total work. So I'm taking another gel halfway through that. Again, something I never did, but it's really paying dividends in terms of my performance during those workouts. I just feel a ton better. I'm recovering from them a lot better as well, as a result. So fueling 2 days per week, and then the other 2 runs are fasted. So I kind of like that split approach. I don't think that most runners need gels for every single run. Certainly, if you like it, you can do it. But I try to keep it for the more higher intensity, higher quality stuff. So
Man, this is fascinating. So I'm 58 and I've always done what you've described of, yeah, it's 18 miles. Maybe I'll have a little water, but I don't need food. I don't need gel. I don't need to eat beforehand. I'll be back in a couple hours. We'll be fine. So I'm from you and David and a couple other folks we've talked to. I'm going to start tipping my toe into that. So I like the Martine for the racing. But man, I'm going to have to mortgage the house if I'm going to use that for training. Any suggestions for people that are in the similar boat that have a certain gel? Maybe it's not Martine, maybe it's something else, but it's a little on the pricey side. Does it matter? Is it just like, just get the cheap one? You got the grams of carbohydrates. That's what you're trying to look for with your training runs. And then sure, every once in a while on a pace run or a tempo run, test out what you're using on race day, but you don't need, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but any thoughts along those lines for folks that are saying, like the idea, still have a budget there, bro?
Yeah, no, it's a great point that you bring up because, if you think about it, I'm using 2 gels during my workout. During my Thursday workout, I'm using 4 to 5 during my long run. So you're spending $30 to $50 potentially on gels during the week. Yeah. It's not an insignificant expense, So yeah, I think that you need to use what you want to use on race day at least a few times. So do it during your marathon specific long run, or do it, sometime when you're running hard and you really want to test like how your system tolerates that. I would certainly use one of those gels. There are definitely tiers of gels. The Morton can be the most expensive, and there are GU energy gels and similar brands, which are maybe $2 to $3 a gel. And there are some that you can get for $1, $1.99. But even again, some people might not have the budget for that. I do think, though, if you just want to use something like honey or maple syrup, I mean, those things will work fine. It's glucose, it's quick carbohydrates. There is, I think, a difference in terms of these gels, these energy gels are formulated with a specific ratio of glucose and fructose and, the amino acids and sodium. So I think that those tend to be a bit more reliable in terms of like, it's this mixture that is probably maybe better for performance. And we've kind of honed this mixture to be well in the gut and then kind of provide this ideal ratio of the different types of sugars. Whereas honey or maple syrup isn't necessarily that, but I think that those can work just as fine. And I've used them, sometimes I'll just take a tablespoon of honey before my workout and it works just fine. The only problem there is finding out something that's going to be portable. If you want to get a little baggie to put your honey in, or I guess they have those tearaway honey packets that you can get from like the hotel breakfast bar. Just steal a couple of those next time you're at a Holiday Inn. Those could probably get messy too. I don't want to get honey on my hands during a run, but any of those can work fine. And you could find a carbohydrate mix to put into your water bottle as well. So there you're getting the hydration and the carbohydrates, and a lot of those are fairly inexpensive, especially, you can buy huge volumes of them and just put in your preferred amount of fluid and make it stronger or weaker. So yeah, there are multiple options based on, what you have, what your income and what you're willing to spend for your weekly long run. But if you want to use something simple found in nature, chew on a few dates before your run, have some honey, have some maple syrup, all that can work fine just as well. I think the only issue there is just the portability and kind of the convenience. Gels are great. You can fit them in your pockets. You can fit them in your little pouch, carry 5 or 6 of them. And, each of them is like a serving. So you kind of know what's in there versus having to measure out honey or maple syrup. So just depends how kind of experimental you want to be. But again, there are multiple ways to go about it. Like you said, fuel is fuel at the end of the day. It's all getting broken down by our body into glucose. So whatever your preferred form of that is, I say go for it.
So one clarification and one tip I want to ask you about. Clarification, and I'll say this, and then you can say, no, Brad, that's not what I mean. Folks, we're talking about performance versus fitness. If you're running for fitness, you don't need a gel. Like, don't leave that back. You don't need the money. You don't need the calories. You're doing it for some other reason. If you're doing it to perform well in a 10K, half marathon, triathlon, etc., that's what Brady's talking about here. Am I right? Is that what you're talking about? Is there a difference between fitness and performance? And then I've got a clarification from you in terms of how you carry all these gels.
Yeah, no, I would say you're spot on there. I mean, if you're if you're just interested in running to get in better shape, you're not doing something where, you're really pushing yourself that hard or don't really care about performance during the run. You don't need a gel. If you're really just training for performance, use these gels. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I wasn't very into just using the sports nutrition stuff for a while is, again, because I just didn't feel like it was necessary for me. And I guess I hadn't used them enough to realize the performance benefit of it. But yeah, certainly all of these fancy sports nutrition products aren't necessary for most people. If you're not training for performance, whole foods will do, get you through. And of course, even if you're a high performing athlete, you could technically use whole foods. I don't think they need sports nutrition, but it all comes down to kind of convenience at that point. And they do tend to be much, much, much more convenient, even if you're spending, a few extra bucks on it.
And folks, just to clarify, Brady and I probably both enjoy the store whole foods, but he's just talking about real foods, not necessarily the grocery store. How do you carry all these gels?
No affiliations.
Yeah, exactly. Neither one of us have these here. I just want to, I'll carry my dog's leash, and that's about as much as I want to be holding when I'm running. So when you're out there, you got 4 gels. What's your strategy? You and I are about the same body size for keeping that from being like, oh yeah, I got my handful of gels in my left hand, or I've got this bouncy belt I'm wearing. Have you found a solution to provide an option for those longer runs that you enjoy that isn't a distraction?
Yeah, so a few options there. I actually have kind of warmed up to the idea of carrying a handheld water bottle during my long runs. I have one of those where kind of your hand slips into this little, it's a Nathan quick squeeze flask or something. So you don't even really have to hold it in terms of, I don't have to exert grip strength. It just slides onto my hand. It is a bit burdensome, I will admit. It's 18 ounces. And so at the beginning of your run, it's filled with water. So I'm getting I think my right arm has gotten significantly bigger.
Oh my gosh. You're a tennis player now.
Yeah, because I carry it in my right, but you kind of get used to it and you switch it back and forth. And so just for my long runs, I've resorted to carrying that, especially just the Austin summer. I mean, you can't go without, taking water on your run. I can stop, of course, circle back to my car or something, but I don't prefer to do that. If I can avoid stopping, I'd like to. So I carry that water bottle with me, and that actually has a zipper pocket, which during my long run, I'll put 3 or 4 gels in there. So that has kind of been one of my options for the long runs. Option number 2, a lot of these split, if you wear like half tights, they will have pockets on the sides. You could put 2 or 3 gels in each of those.
And those don't bug you? You're not feeling like...
It doesn't, no. You barely feel it, no. The pockets are pretty decent. So the gels don't shake around. And there are multiple shorts that are kind of designed for that. I don't have any particular brands to recommend, but if you just look for like a marathon racing split short or a half tight, they'll often have like multiple pockets where you can put those gels. And then I think the final option is to invest in, you mentioned belts, which can sometimes get bouncy, but I have a Spy belt. I don't know if you've ever heard of that brand before, but you can get them on Amazon for $25. I wish I had it up here with me, but it's downstairs. So just this very thin belt. I mean, probably 2 inches thick. It's elastic and adjustable. I put that around my waist. I carry my phone in that during all of my runs. I do run with a phone, so people are going to take me less seriously now. I run with my phone in my podcast in my ears, so I know I'm not a serious runner, I guess. But I put my phone
Guys,
in
he's a 2:30 marathoner. I think we'll still keep him in that category.
I have my iPhone, 15 Pro Max in there, and it doesn't bounce. I don't even notice it. I mean, I put that around my waist and I don't notice it the entire run. It's waterproof as well. And you can fit gels in that. So if you didn't want to take your phone, or even if you wanted to take your phone in addition to gels, they would fit in that as well. So I would recommend the belt's probably the best option for some people. You're not going to notice it at all. It's SPI belt. That's the brand. Again, I don't have any affiliation with them, but it's the best. It's the best belt I've found for holding stuff during a run. So
do you put a kettlebell in there too?
You probably could, yeah. Get like a little.
I've got a phone. I've got a. Oh, all right. So, now, yeah, the paces on your training runs just became even more impressive, my friend. That's with you carrying those 5 pounds of extra.
Yeah, my 5-pound iPhone holding me down. Yeah.
Let's talk about strength training. You're a runner, so obviously you don't do strength training, right?
Of course not. No, I don't do as much as I should, I guess is the right answer to your question.
In a perfect world, what would you be doing?
In a perfect world, I would be doing 2 strength training sessions a week. And by strength training session, I mean 30 minutes to 60 minutes where I actually go to the gym and cycle through, 5 to 6 exercises, 3 to 5 sets of, 8 to 12 reps, like your standard kind of resistance training. That's what I would do.
Hitting everything or avoiding the legs and just focusing on core and glutes?
I would probably do like kind of core, glutes, and some upper body stuff. But I think for runners, it's like training legs. You want to kind of do some things that are going to be more specific to like developing like power. I mean, I think deadlifts and squats for runners, super good, as long as you don't get injured and you can progress safely. That can yield some benefits. I don't think you need to do anything to try to increase the size necessarily of your legs. You might gain a little leg mass as a result of that, which probably isn't a bad thing. Some of us runners could stand to gain a couple extra pounds of muscle. So yeah, I mean, kind of whatever you enjoy doing. And there are multiple things, like you don't have to squat or deadlift. You can do Bulgarian split squats, anything, I think. So just whole body kind of resistance training routine, I guess, is what I would say. And that's what I would do 2 days per week if, in an ideal world, like you said. But again, I haven't been as good about that. And honestly, it's kind of a result of prioritization. I hate citing kind of time as that barrier because I have plenty of time. I do 2 hours of endurance work a day, so I could sacrifice some of that and go to the gym and strength train. But what I kind of am more leaning on lately is this, I guess I'll call it, it's not my term, but kind of this like exercise snack approach to resistance training, where I'd say 2 to 3 days of the week, I pick 2 to 3 exercises that I can do with what I have at home. And I'll just kind of do that stuff throughout the day. So I'll use an example. So I have 3 kettlebells at home. One's 25, one's 35, one's 45 pounds. And so say it's like a Tuesday, I'm going to say, okay, today I'm going to do Bulgarian split squats. I'm going to do pull-ups on my door frame pull-up bar that I have. And then I'm going to do calf raises. And so throughout the day, I will just try to accumulate 4 to 6 sets of all of those exercises. And again, that's far from ideal because you're kind of really not dedicated and focused on building strength like you would be in the gym. The rest between the sets is variable just because I kind of do it in between like different bouts of work. Sure. But for me at this stage of my life, that's just what I have found that works. Is it ideal for building as much strength as I probably could? No, I do think that it's helping keeping me injury free. I have noticed improvements in strength in my running performance because of it. It's not the best that I could be doing, but that's kind of the approach that I've latched onto right now. And I enjoy it as well. So I kind of like doing it. It's something I can just do like in between my day-to-day tasks. And so I kind of like it. I don't feel like it's taking away any of my time from say work or anything else. And so that's kind of my strength training routine, but runners should, I think could be better about strength training, myself included. And so that wouldn't be, what I would advise someone to do unless they were in a similar situation to me. It's like, let's just kind of try to see what we can get in versus, I would rather go to the gym 2 to 3 days a week and actually work on specific stuff.
Now you've got a new baby. You're what, mid-30s?
Yeah, 30. I just turned 31 in July.
So that's you in that stage of life. We all go through different phases of life. For the 40-year-olds or the early 50-year-olds, what would you recommend? And then let's go another 15 years to the late 50s up to 70. What would you recommend? Because my guess is your thoughts are different for what you can get away with at 31 and what somebody that's 48 or 69 or whatever might be. Any thoughts on those different life phases or biochemistry of the body phases, if you will?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because, as we get to age 40 and 50 and beyond, there's some pretty compelling evidence that strength and muscle mass begin to decline. Of course, that says nothing about our ability to gain muscle and strength at those ages. We can build strength at any age, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. If you do dedicated progressive overload resistance training, you can build strength and you can build muscle mass coupled with, adequate protein intake, which people need to be focused on, obviously. So yeah, my recommendations would certainly change. And like I said, even for a 30-year-old, my recommendations would kind of change on what is ideal. But
when the baby's sleeping.
Yes, exactly. 40, 50, 60. You probably should be getting into the gym twice a week minimum. I don't think you need to be there 4 or 5 times a week, but twice a week, they've shown you can build strength just, training twice a week, as long as, the volume's the same as you would get training 3 or 4 times a week. So, go to the gym twice a week for 60 minutes. And just, again, I'm not going to say like what types of exercises to do, because there's, you can do anything, reps, sets, types of exercises, just find something that you like. But yeah, I think you really need to be a little bit more dedicated about it, and training for strength / hypertrophy for those people should certainly become a priority. It will definitely depend on like your baseline, as well. If you're someone who's very, very strong and has strength trained their entire life, at that point, it might just become about maintenance for you. You just need 2 days per week where you're lifting to maintain your muscle mass and your muscle strength, prevent that decline in it. Now, if you've never strength trained before and you're 40 or 50 or 60, you might need to put in a little bit more work to get to a certain baseline of strength. And if you want to increase your muscle mass, definitely you're going to have to train a bit harder, maybe do 2 to 3 times a week, or do a little bit more what you would consider heavy, high intensity, like resistance training type of stuff. But that all requires, and I say going to the gym, but if you have a home gym with the equipment that a regular gym would have, then that's fine as well. But just to say that you need like a dedicated resistance training session twice per week, I think, if you want to reduce injury, maintain your muscle mass and things like that. Because at those ages, it does require a bit more work, both, attention to nutrition, which is important, but really building strength through resistance training. Just eating protein isn't going to really do anything unless you're actually training, unfortunately. So,
or fortunately,
have to do that. Yeah. Or fortunately, that resistance training. So, yeah, definitely important, to do that. But there's just, I think we're learning a lot about aging and muscle, not just cardiovascular fitness, but like aging and muscle lately. And like, I think a lot of the ideas are changing, and traditional thinking is like, oh, you hit 50 and you just decline down into frailty. And it's like, that's not really the case. If you are 40 or 50 or 60 and you train twice a week and it's a decent intensity, like you will maintain most of your muscle mass and you're not going to lose it. A lot of these like age, and something I've been thinking about like a lot lately with regards to not only strength and muscle mass, but like the cardiorespiratory fitness as well. A lot of what we think about as age-related declines and all of these things are really inactivity associated declines in fitness. Because yes, as people get older, they lose muscle mass, they lose cardiorespiratory fitness. But what do they also do? They train less. They engage in less exercise. And so in like a theoretical example where, you have somebody who, say, using myself, for example, like, what happens if I maintain my levels of strength training and endurance training, or as close to maintain them as possible in the next decade or 2 decades or 3 decades? How much does your fitness preserve? I do think that there's a natural decline, but it's certainly not this like 10% per decade, 10% per year that's like just happens compared to somebody who just like stops training completely and lets their body go. Well, sure, you're going to naturally decline and fall off a cliff. So our thoughts are changing a lot, and the body's ability to adapt to training and, what we can do with age, and all of it is very, very promising to read. So.
Yeah. And folks, you've heard me say many times, we know we lose about 1% per year after age 40, which is what Brady's referencing, all things being equal, but that's your choice. It doesn't have to all things be equal in your life. You don't have to follow the trends of most 50 and 60 and 70-year-olds. You can shift that and not let it be equal. So I love what you're saying there. One of the things we've been playing around with, and this has not been studied at all, but something just for our listeners, basic way you can monitor these things over time is take push-ups, add them to your pull-ups. So this is max of each, and then divide it by your 5K time minus your plank time. And the higher that number, the better. And you're not comparing it to Brady. You're not comparing it to me or your neighbor. You're comparing it to you. And if you'll check that once a year as you get into your 50s, 60s, 70s, yes, it's going to decrease slightly, but it encompasses a large span of things by getting that core with the plank time, the VO2 max with the 5K, and then the pull-ups and push-ups, and you don't need equipment for any of this stuff. So anyway, that's one we might want to play with at some point. You highlighted a study recently comparing sedentary adults to those that were at least moderate exercisers. So we're going to step away from the elite stuff, the high performance stuff here, but moderate exercisers, meaning about 150 minutes a week. Folks, that's about 2.5 hours. Talk us through that one a little bit. What did we learn from that study that you highlighted?
Yeah, that study I found to be very interesting. And the reason that, the study was conducted is because in a lot of exercise physiology research, there's, you recruit, say, active people, or you basically recruit a group of subjects, and some of them are going to do exercise, some of them are not going to. So just using this as the basic example. Well, a lot of the times it's very common to recruit groups and use a control group who is a sedentary control group, because you don't want the results to be confounded by the fact that, the people in this group are engaging in exercise, so they're different than your average person. So they use the sedentary control group as the quote unquote normal people for which to compare the effects of an exercise training intervention, or, if it's a cross-sectional study, to compare how exercisers different from non-exercisers. And the whole hypothesis of this study was that, and maybe hypothesis is the wrong word, but we shouldn't be using sedentary control groups in exercise physiology research, because they don't represent what is evolutionarily normal for humans who are naturally physically active. So sedentarism kind of represents this divergence from the norm versus someone who is doing 150 minutes, to use an example, of activity per week, which is, not high level endurance training, but, it's just moderate. If
30 minutes, 5 days a week. Yeah,
exactly. 30 minutes, 5 days a week, which should be argued, this represents the norm. These are your normal people. They're not above average because they engage in 150 minutes. These are normal. The sedentary people are a divergence on the lower end, and then you have your endurance athletes who are diverging on the higher end. So this study kind of just set out to compare that and say, or to compare these two groups of people who are moderately active and then a group of sedentary people who did no structured exercise. They didn't report doing anything that elevated their heart rate in their day-to-day lives. So exercise nor just physical activity. And I guess that's kind of an important distinction to make sometimes, Brad. Like, we talk about physical activity versus exercise. A lot of the studies that measure, these people are doing 150 minutes of physical activity, that's typically characterized by having them wear like an accelerometer for a week or so. So a device that will track their activity levels, and it just gauges their intensity of their day-to-day activity. So that could be exercise, or it could just be being physically active. So not being sedentary, whereas exercise is actually like structured activity that you set aside to do. It's purposeful. Exactly. So the people who were doing 150 minutes of activity in they were not the control groups. That would be the experimental group in this study. And then the sedentary people, again, did no exercise. And so the researchers wanted to compare what are just the characteristics of these people at rest. What do their mitochondria look like? What do their blood biomarkers look like? What is their fat oxidation? If we take a muscle biopsy and we do a bunch of these in vitro assessments, what are their oxidative metabolism enzymes, their glycolytic metabolism enzymes, a bunch of, very invasive and some non-invasive procedures to compare these two groups. And then what do they look like during exercise? So let's have them do a maximal exercise test to exhaustion. What do the sedentary people look like compared to the moderately active people? And despite the fact that they really didn't differ that much in their activity levels, I mean, some people doing 0, some people doing 2.5 hours per week of physical activity. It's a difference, but it's not an enormous difference. It's not like you're taking Tour de France cyclists versus sedentary people, but they found some pretty stark differences, not only at rest, but during exercise in terms of their metabolic function. So at rest, kind of as you would expect, people who were moderately active, they had better fat metabolism, mitochondrial enzymes, mitochondrial proteins, higher levels of all of these things, just in general, indicating better mitochondrial function, more dense mitochondria in these people. They had lower levels of lactate. So for those who may not be familiar, lactate is a byproduct of glycolytic metabolism. So when the body breaks down glucose, lactate is produced. It's not this toxic waste product that some people once thought that contributed to muscle fatigue. In fact, it's actually the opposite. So lactate is fuel for the brain. It's fuel for the muscles.
Right.
The body loves to utilize lactate. And I think that's one of the reasons why exercise is so beneficial for like the brain. Because it is produced, whether you're doing high intensity exercise or low intensity exercise, you're producing lactate. The only difference tends to be, we produce a little bit more of it when we're more intense and we clear a lot less of it. So our blood lactate levels are higher. Anyways, all of that is just to say at rest, the sedentary people had higher levels of lactate compared to the moderately active people. And then during exercise,
because they weren't clearing it. Because their bodies weren't used to it. It was like, I don't know what to do with this.
Not only were they not clearing it as much, but that would indicate that at rest, they're using more carbohydrate, glucose metabolism at rest. And our body at rest should, and I put should in quotes, I guess, but should be burning mostly fat. We're not doing anything. We're resting. So fat metabolism should predominate at rest. So we shouldn't really be producing a ton of lactate either. But these people were. So they were probably producing more and not clearing as much lactate as these moderately active folks were. And then they put them under a maximal exercise test. And this is where they really started to show some massive differences. So they cycle for this test. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I do sort of remember them. I think the sedentary individuals, they reached their VO2 max at a power output of around 150 watts, which is decent, but it's not that high. The moderately active people reached their VO2 max around 250 to 300 watts. So almost double that of the people who were sedentary. But it wasn't necessarily the power output that was kind of the astonishing thing, but it was at immediately almost after starting this exercise test, around 100 watts, less than 100 watts pedaling on the bicycle, the sedentary group of people were producing high levels of lactate. So their lactate levels were, above, I think, 2 millimolar, which I don't think is well accepted, but that's kind of what people cite as above that is like you're above your lactate threshold, 2 to 4 millimolar. So they reached kind of very high levels of lactate at the end of the test, or even at the middle of the test, they were around 2 to 4. I think even some reaching 6, 7, 8 millimolar of lactate. The moderately active people, they had low levels of lactate at the beginning, and they only reached kind of 4 millimolar by the end of the test. So higher power output, less lactate production, and all of that was to indicate, they were better at clearing lactate, but they were also probably producing less because they were burning more fat during that exercise test, despite the fact that they were exercising a lot harder than the sedentary people. So, some of that was, very technical in explaining it, and there were a lot more results, and I wrote about it. And again, I don't have the paper right in front of me, but just stark metabolic differences between these two groups, and a lot of results indicating that these sedentary people were quite metabolically unhealthy. I mean, if you have, their lactate levels were around 2 millimolar when they were barely cycling, so something that would be equivalent to a very slow walk. That's not indicative of a very robust metabolism or robust mitochondrial function. And it indicates that people who don't do any exercise are probably representative of a more unhealthy phenotype. And so if we're using these people in research studies to compare results of exercise training or to compare to exercise trained individuals, it's probably, overinflating perhaps the results of some of these studies. And in fact, we should actually be using these moderately active people as sort of the control participants. Exactly.
Interesting. All right. Time's flown by. I knew it would. I got one more for you if you got time. Can we throw one more in there?
Absolutely.
All right. You did some research. You were published in the Journal of Physiology back in 2019 about ketones. We seem to be learning a lot since then. What's the latest on that? What do we know? Are you using that at all with your training or racing? Talk to us about this whole ketone thing.
Ketones are so interesting because the initial research that was probably, it's probably been almost 10 to 12 years now that came out, was assessing their ability to serve as this performance fuel during exercise. Yeah. And so for those who don't know, ketones, when our body breaks down fat, when it burns fat for energy, it produces ketone bodies, which have kind of been labeled as this fourth fuel. So carbohydrates, protein, fat, and then ketones. So our brain can use ketones to produce energy in the form of ATP. Our heart, our skeletal muscle can use ketones to produce energy. And so the thinking was that, oh, well, what happens if we supplement with exogenous ketones? Are they going to spare carbohydrates? Are we going to use ketones first and spare carbohydrates and fat? And are they going to be this sort of super fuel for endurance exercise performance? All the Tour de France riders are apparently using them. And so it's like this secret fuel that everybody's going to be using. Some of the initial studies showed they enhanced performance if it was like 90 minutes or longer. But a lot of that hasn't been replicated. I really haven't seen any study in the last 5 or so years that has shown taking ketones during exercise improves performance during the exercise bout. And so the research on ketones now has sort of shifted in terms of, well, maybe these have a different role in terms of promoting exercise recovery. And I think the data there are a bit more strong. They need to certainly, I think there's a lot more evidence that needs to come out for them. But that initial study that I wasn't actually an author on like the study, but I wrote a commentary about it with a few of my colleagues, and we wrote about it. So the study looked at what happens if you take ketones, and they did a decent amount. I think they were doing like 3 ketone shots a day, but during a period of overtraining or overreaching, can they prevent overreaching? So they took this group of cyclists and they basically just threw everything at them for, I think it was 7 days, maybe 20, maybe even 21 days, but they just did this severe period of a few weeks of overreaching where they trained them so hard. Like, can we overtrain these guys? Let's try to do it. Let's train them as hard as we can, limit their recovery. We're working out twice a day, every day, but then supplement with ketones during this overtraining period. And compared to the group who didn't supplement with ketones, the group who did, they had kind of lower markers of overreaching and overtraining. They had better performance at the end of the overtraining period. Essentially, they didn't get overtrained when they were taking these ketones after their workouts. They took it before sleep. So they were supplementing throughout the entire period. And it kind of prevented all of these overtraining and overreaching symptoms and prevented the performance declines. So that was a pretty cool study, pretty cool initial study. A few have come out since then. And so, the thinking has sort of shifted and like, oh, can we use these after exercise to help enhance recovery? And we don't quite know how they might actually do that. I'm sure that there's research going on. I think it definitely has something to do with probably central nervous system, definitely probably has something to do with muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown and glycogen restoration, I think, where they can help after exercise. So as a post-exercise recovery tool, that's where I've actually started to use them. You're going to talk with David Roach probably about this as well. He used them in his training, and I interviewed him for my Substack, and we talked about the same thing. So I'm using them now twice a week after my workouts in the hopes that, this kind of recovery phenomenon and improving recovery is actually valid. So like right after a workout, essentially, I just take ketones with me. I'll take, Ketone IQ is the brand that I use. And I'll take a shot of ketones after my workout. And then, I'll have that with food as well, because the ketones themselves aren't necessarily very nutrient dense. There's like 70 calories in the thing, but very interesting, I think, as a post-exercise recovery tool, again, just to help expedite kind of the recovery process. Taking them before sleep as well, I think, could be a good strategy. So take it after your workout, or maybe take it after sleep. They can be quite expensive. So if you're taking 2 or 3 of these things a day, it goes back to the gels. I mean, they're $5 to $7 a serving. So it's not cheap to take them every day. That's why I've limited my use of them to just immediately, like after my workout, twice a week, after my workout and after my long run, kind of the key workouts, not just my regular training run. But I'm more bullish on them for recovery, less so on endurance exercise, using them during. I wouldn't do that now. I have at some point. I've experimented with using them during exercise, and I just don't think they have much validity there. And in fact, I think they may actually do the opposite of what we think, because if you're doing something like hard, so say like a 10K, half marathon, anything, any race, any run where you're going to be running pretty hard, well, I want to be I want to be utilizing carbohydrate at the highest rate that I can during that.
Fuel
so if I take
fire.
something like a ketone, if you take a ketone, you're going to suppress carbohydrate oxidation. Your body's going to increase the oxidation of those ketones that you're giving it. So I steer clear of them for that. I think the utility for maybe ultra endurance running as well, for people who are, marathon running, maybe 2, depending on your pace. But, if you're going for 2, 3, 4, 5+ hours and you're doing ultra endurance running, I actually think they may have some utility there, because there have actually been a few studies there showing they improve your alertness if you take them while ultra running. You're out there for hours to days running, so they can improve your alertness. There was a study showing that it increased dopamine while running an endurance race, and something about EPO production as well, like during or after an endurance running bout. So seem to be some utility for exercise, and I think there it depends on the intensity. But as a recovery technique, a lot of cool evidence there, and I would recommend some people experiment with that if they're willing to. They don't taste great, I will say that, but you don't drink them and sip them for the flavor. You kind of just slug it down for the performance utility. That
you started to reference sleep with this, and then you got on a different avenue with that. Anything you want to share about their connection to enhanced sleep or depth or quality or anything?
Yeah. So with the sleep, it wasn't maybe necessarily for the benefits of it on sleep per se, but in that overtraining study that I mentioned, they had them take it before sleep to hopefully help promote that recovery process overnight. But ketones for sleep, actually, again, something that hasn't really been that well investigated, but there's kind of a theoretical application there where it may enhance sleep, but I can't say for sure whether they do it or not. I've taken them before sleep a couple of times. I slept well, but again, that's my N=1 experience.
The baby had a good night.
Yeah, I don't feed ketones to my baby, but who knows? Maybe put a little bit in his.
Instead of the old grandma thing of vodka or whatever, whiskey or whatever, it's I sneak some ketones in. So.
Some ketones in there.
Exactly. Brady, thanks so much, man. This is fun. I knew it was gonna be fun. I love following you. We'll have a link to your stuff in the info. Keep up the great work. It matters. Like, you're getting through to people. It's really starting to grow. I'm watching you. I'm paying attention. I'm learning. So thank you for taking the time today, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, Brad, thanks for giving me the platform. And, same goes to you. Thanks, for all the work that you do and getting stuff like this out there, and just like promoting conversations and talk about running, and, just being fun to interact with as well. Like I said, I've loved our various interactions. It's fun to follow your training as well, your commentary on running. So
the old
keep
guy,
up the good work as well.
Good stuff, Brady. We covered a lot of information there. This might be one of those you need to rewind a few times and hit the highlights that you were wanting to dig into. If you are an individual who's been considering pursuing your MBHWC approved coach certification with the program rated #1 by Fortune magazine, now is the time. Our first cohort for 2025 kicks off in January, and it includes all the latest updates from the MBHWC, including a complimentary study group for those pursuing the national board exam. All the details available on our institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or email us anytime with questions. Results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll set up some time to talk through your specific situation, plans, questions, concerns, etc. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Coaching Lab podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.